So, hey, Ryan, good to see you, and congratulations. Your book's coming out soon on long COVID. And so, I guess we've known each other for a while because I met you when you were, I think, working on your documentary initially about your own experience with chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME, CFS, or ME, whichever you're calling it. So, I guess first, why don't you tell us about um, the book itself and what the book's about?
Yeah, thank you, David, and it's great to see you again. I have a book coming out November 15th called The Long Haul, which will be published through Postal Press and distributed by Simon and Schuster. And in some ways, it's a follow up to this documentary, Forgotten Plague, that came out in 2016 and is
Oh,
available on
long
Amazon
ago.
Prime. The story kind of combines the human experience and personal experience of myself and hundreds of other people with long COVID from around the U.S. and around the country, and kind of points toward what we can do, what the biomedical establishment can do and ought to do to fight this new surge of post-viral disease in the wake of the pandemic, and also points the way for what policymakers ought to be doing, which could be at the congressional level and across different agencies.
Mhm.
To
And do yourself also, what's your, and actually, I'm not sure, what is your COVID experience yourself? I know you have me. Have you had also a post-COVID situation as well?
Mhm. Yeah, when the pandemic began in like March 2020, I was pretty fearful that knowing how my body responds to viruses, and knowing how most people with chronic fatigue syndrome or ME respond to viruses, knew that this could well be the second blow to my system that wiped me out and disabled me more severely than I was sick for about a year
Hmm.
when I was in high school, and sure enough, when eventually I did get COVID in at the end of 2020, and like Christmas Eve of 2020, and I was sick for about 3 months or so, disabled by full time, and was on the short term disability from my job at CNN, with the you know, fatigue. A lot of the I can go into more detail, but fatigue and brain fog and pain were major components of that, and generally driven by a weak immune system, probably natural killer cells, the low natural killer cell function, which made it hard for me to fight off the virus.
Did it feel different to you from your ME, or did it feel like the same thing intensified, or did you experience it as a sort of a different illness, or as a kind of a repetitive ME?
It was very similar to Emmy. I definitely feel like it was a tad different, and I would personally just suggest that that's probably just because it's a different virus or a different intensity of virus. And I think my ME symptoms probably were set in motion by Lyme disease rather than by COVID. All those things cause fatigue, brain fog, and post-exertional malaise, and a similar list of symptoms. So my post-COVID symptoms were a little bit different. I think the neurological part of it, the cognitive dysfunction. In the book, I describe it as being like almost like a Dementor from Harry Potter, like descends on your nervous system and like is like yanking your soul out.
Hmm.
And that was a tad different from what ME felt like, but it's a slightly different flavor of it.
So, from the work you've done and the research you've done, is it your sense that, I mean, the two, how do you understand the difference between the two? Well, first, actually, how are you defining long COVID and the variations on what that term means for other people? And then how do you sort of
Mm.
see it overlapping or its connection with ME or MECFS?
Yeah, so in general, like your average acute COVID case, probably isn't going to last more than a couple weeks. Once you get into probably a month or so of symptoms of not getting better, that's when you start teetering into this long COVID category.
Mhm.
The World Health Organization defines long COVID as or a post-COVID condition as lasting about 3 months or more. And then the basic definition of MECVS usually is around 6-month mark. So in this 3-month to 6-month mark of where someone's a long hauler, they might not quite qualify yet for the ME/CFS definition, but there's studies that show, a handful of studies show that about half of people with long COVID develop a ME/CFS type symptom pattern. And we know that if someone stays sick for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, that's when you start to feel that the likelihood of recovering from it is going to be diminished. So I guess the basic answer to that is about half of people with long COVID are probably in the ME category.
And so that means basically, just to sort of clarify that, that means that basically they probably will have the sort of cluster of non-specific symptoms, like especially post-exertional malaise or sort of recurrent relapses, brain fog, or cognitive dysfunctions of some kind, and disordered sleep, and possibly some sort of dysautonomia or POTS or some sort of orthostatic intolerance. I mean, that's the general cluster
Mhm.
that would sort of parallel the two.
Yeah, and I'd also say just note that the POTS is probably more common in the post-COVID conditions than ME/CFS is.
Mhm.
Uh, Very common for people to have that huge rise in heart rate while doing nothing at all, or simply standing up, and you get a raise in heart rate by 30 points, and which would be a POTS definition.
So given that they're not quite the same from your perspective, I guess, but overlapping, and possibly because, viruses affect different people
Mhm.
differently, and sort of these are two different, we don't really know in many cases of ME what the viral trigger was. Do you see there's been sort of debate in the ME community, especially initially and to some degree ongoing, about, long COVID getting so much attention, and we're sort of not we, I'm not, but the community, the community is being ignored. And then there's others who are much more, yeah, well, these mechanisms seem like they're probably quite similar, if not the same. And so the research into long COVID will definitely help, or very likely help people with ME. And in fact, people with long COVID are getting diagnosed with ME. So how do you sort of see navigating between those two in terms of, the research will, do you feel the long COVID research will be helping ME patients and sort of vice versa, and how should that be integrated?
Yeah, I definitely think it should be as integrated as possible. I think the best bumper sticker way I can describe this is quoting an advocate, Rivka Solomon in Massachusetts, who says that people with ME/CFS have all the wisdom, and people with long COVID have all the political capital. So
Mm,
you see these online groups, particularly the Body Politic and the Patient-Led Research Collaborative, which have been leaders in long COVID research. They profit incredibly from their hand in glove relationship with ME/CFS advocates, and the people who are best poised to explain the terrain of science and medicine and policymaking to long haulers are ME, longtime people disabled by ME. So I think that what I see happening is a lot of the when groups like the Patient-Led Research Collaborative are testifying in front of Congress, which is there has not been hearings for ME by Congress, but there's been multiple hearings for long COVID. Um, Advocates for long COVID, like Lisa McCorkle, are very directly channeling the message of ME/CFS from the past few decades. So I'd see that long COVID being the tip of the spear for how a whole handful of post-viral conditions may finally get listened to in the halls of power. And then, so that's a political argument there. And then as researchers are designing studies, um, it would be very helpful. It doesn't always happen, but it should be happening, and it's happening a little bit now, and should happen more in the future. Is to design a long COVID group, an ME type control group, and then having previously healthy people. I should say a control group, and then a comparison group of ME, and then the study group of long COVID is very helpful. That way, both conditions get
And so what's your assessment of how that's been going so far in terms of that sort of integration?
yeah, there's a $1.15 billion initiative through the National Institutes of Health called the Recover Initiative, which I think is off to a slow start, I guess, to put it mildly and kindly. That has been a place where ME activists have been focusing and trying to get that integrated into the getting ME/CFS as a comparison group into this larger cohort of COVID long haulers that's being studied. I don't, I'll, to my knowledge, at this point, that effort has not yet come to fruition, if it ever will. But I think that there are a few ways of innovating at the NIH and using long COVID as a comparison group. Should those researchers, come to fully understand the decades of post-viral literature.
Okay. What do you think? I mean, we've seen some response from some of the folks who were, have been pushing for years the deconditioning model and dysfunctional beliefs model of ME/CFS are now pushing a similar kind of model for long COVID, both in the U.S. and as well in the U.K. especially, and sort of some studies about CBT for long COVID or variations on what we've already seen, and what many people believe have been debunked or discredited. So have you, did you come across that in your research? Did you come across that as something that patients were experienced from their clinicians?
It's very, and I can, address it from a few different angles, from just the ground level of patient support groups. Body politics is a really good example, that it's quite common that people would report going to thinking that they'd found the right place and going to a long COVID clinic, and then being told that they either need to go to therapy or exercise their way out of it. And especially in my reporting, which I think is probably similar to what you're hearing, and stories that are coming out, long COVID clinics in the UK have I think an even bigger problem with pushing the psychogenic model, which is Britain has been a place where this comes from. Yeah. But on the other hand of it, I do want to I'll note that among people who have testified in front of Congress, and these are basically committees created by US Congress to deal with the coronavirus crisis, experts who have been summoned there have been saying the right things. So I do, some of the experience at the highest level shows the correct paradigm, I believe. And then Dr. Tony Fauci has testified in front of Congress saying the same things. And then Senator Tim Kaine is a long hauler, and he's been adamant. So I think it's important to talk about what is happening in the leadership from the top, at least in the US context. And Senator Kaine and Dr. Fauci, I think are viewing this through the right paradigm.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, I think, yeah, we are in a case where the sort of paradigm is might be shifting from sort of the psychogenic for, for ME/CFS as well. And for, I think, it's hard to see all these patients, all these people around the world and just assume it's all psychogenic or most of it's psychogenic or, So, I mean, I think that.
I think, yeah, because just one key difference here is that this is all happening in real time, tied to a known global pandemic. So the initiating incident is much more known in the long COVID situation, and it's just assumed that it's physical because of the acute COVID is physical, and so it makes sense that there some kind of long-term sequelae would be physical. When you lose that smoking gun viral trigger, which is in most pre-pandemic ME cases, that's where it's a little bit easier to introduce a psychological model.
Well, I think that's true to a large extent. I mean, I think it's much easier to track, but I mean, we do see people in high profile people saying, oh, all these long COVID cases, but specifically because we're not finding specific things on standard testing, the cognitive dysfunction is psychogenic. The POTS, I just was reviewing a study about POTS being psychogenic because you had a previous POTS experience, of being dizzy while standing. So then you presume that you're going to be dizzy while standing. So you're creating your own dizziness while standing by your, physiological response. Anyway, we still see this happening all around long COVID as well. This kind of theorizing, even though I think it's obvious to most people or many people that this is a natural worldwide experiment of post-viral illness that we're seeing, and it's really hard to attribute it to the degree that they would like to psychogenic or psychosomatic or psychosocial strain or some of the other kinds of mechanisms that have been suggested.
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways, and I don't know if there's any way to fully establish that to not just get the right studies done and doing it through the right lens, but at least winning the larger communication game around the science.
Mhm.
And
But
oh,
do you think,
I'll just,
what do you think long COVID, I mean, how do you see long COVID having shifted the argument? I mean, it does seem like overall it has shifted the argument, and it has sort of been proof of concept of what people with ME have been saying all along.
mhm. I think it's shifting, and the one of the most interesting things that one of the more exciting things I came across in the book is one of the at the post-COVID clinic at Mount Sinai, which Dr. David Petrino is
Mhm.
one of the clinicians there, and he partnered with a breathing specialist who had experience working in the Navy for fighter pilots who are undergoing high G situations on bombing runs, and when you see it through the lens of an astronaut or a fighter pilot, and you see that the lack of blood flow to their head, as related to gravity, is very similar in a fighter pilot as it is to a POTS patient. Similar thing happening with Dr. Cindy Bateman at the who's running a MECFS and post-COVID clinic in Utah. She uses the test for POTS and calls it the NASA lean test. And she's really cognizant that she's repurposing NASA research into her POTS understanding. And I think that when you see it as part of this larger whole, and bringing in understandings from different fields that where it is not in any way assumed that it would be psychological.
Mhm.
I think that's one way I see the communication game changing and getting into a better field of biomedical innovation.
And so what is the thing that you hope when people read the book that they kind of leave, if there's sort of one big idea or one thing that you really want to convey?
I At the core, I just believe that uh, patient voices matter is the main thing I wanted people to read this book and understand. And then the lived experience of suffering creates a form of wisdom, and we can use that wisdom to change hearts and change minds and change policy.
Mhm.
And if we believe that patient voices matter and use a patient-centered model and see this through a disability lens, um, I I think that makes the right funding decisions happen, which then creates the right research, and then enables us to do
How,
work to repurpose drugs and fast track treatments.
how do you mean see it through a disability lens? What do you
Seeing this as a widespread policy problem across all of society, where we know that women's rights matter, or civil rights, or gay rights. And then in the world post 1990, after the signing of the Americans with Disability Act, disability rights are a generational innovation that we experience now. And we know that post-viral mass disabling events occurred in the 1918 flu with encephalitis lethargica, and then following the polio pandemic, and then following the HIV pandemic in the form of AIDS. So in the post-COVID environment, we're dealing with a mass disabling event. Therefore, it should be seen through a lens of disability rights. And with disability rights, we know that, at least in the US context, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act that would entitles people to certain benefits or through employer accommodations in the workplace. That then leads to a lens for doing economic policy making and explaining the sheer size of the impact on the workforce. If we know that this has a huge impact on the workforce and on the economy, that then should light a fire under the butt of legislators to get the right science done.
Okay, listen, thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank
Uh,
you.
Hold on a second. Let me, well, I will, hold on a second. I'm looking for the,